To end the conference, I'm delighted to be joined by Katarina Barilov and Gwen Leiter, so if they could make their way up here. We're going to finish by looking at emergency use cases for advanced aircraft. Unfortunately, Bill cannot be with us for the session today. So, first off, a lot of the emergency use cases for aviation is done by helicopters currently. So my first question is, why build a purpose-built AAM solution rather than retrofitting a helicopter? But get to that once you've both introduced yourselves and jump air and go. I'm getting ahead of myself. It's been a long 2 days.
So you're fine. Really quickly, we're building an aircraft purposefully built for EMS in rural areas to get help for people who cannot currently get it in a timely manner.
Hello, everyone. I am Gwen Leiter, and Go-Aero's sole mission is saving lives, along with Boeing, NASA, RTX, and Honeywell, and about 50 different aerospace and first responder organizations around the world. We have put together a global competition where we have invited teams around the world to join us in building an emergency response aircraft that will rescue people who need help, bring in first responders to those who need it, bring in needed goods or supplies or services, and that is for tsunamis and wildfires and everyday medical emergencies and natural disasters. So all of us have come together, including the FAA, who helped write our technical rules, to bring these emergency response aircraft to life.
So I'm really glad our planned tsunami warning was helpful. So that's makes this very topical. Katarina, your jump aero solution is quite interesting because you're not looking at transporting patients. You're looking at bringing doctors and medically trained people to patients as opposed to moving someone quickly to an airport.
Yes, and this kind of goes into answering your first question as to why we decided to build a purpose-built aircraft as opposed to utilizing existing platforms. And it's really because there's certain things that electric aviation offers that are really unique that cannot currently be done with combustion engines. Namely, you can go really fast and you can spool up very quickly and your operating costs are much lower. And so if you think about what you can do with that technology in the most effective way, and it's really to get really kind of, we decided that we were not really going to go immediately to transportation. We're going to go to providing services as quickly as possible. Because if you look at how much you can do with a single paramedic or a single EMT in order to offset medical bills and impact quality of life in those time-critical medical emergencies, there's a huge, dramatic increase. Helicopters are really meant for transportation. They're not meant for emergency time-critical response. It takes a really long time to spool up a helicopter. You need, at least a team, a crew chief, you need a paramedic, you need the pilot. A lot of times you bring a mechanic with you as well. So by the time that you get the bird up in the air, we're talking minutes. It's just not, eVTOLs can be complementary, but they're not going to be doing the same mission.
Gwen, you're slightly different. You're not looking at such a specific use case. You're looking at an aircraft that you can utilize in a variety of different ways depending on the emergency that you're responding to. So presumably the purpose you see is slightly different.
So Katarina is focused on one specific mission, which is an incredibly important mission. What we have done, because we have the luxury of being a competition where we can solicit for a number of different missions as opposed to one entity, one company focused on a specific mission, we spent about 6 months interviewing first responders, hundreds of first responders around the world saying, okay, what do you not have that you need? And apropos to your first question on helicopters, they repeatedly said to us, helicopters are great emergency response tools, but helicopters are expensive to procure. more expensive to operate over the course of their lifetime. So many localities and municipalities don't even have them to use for emergency response. So too, they have difficulty in and out of tight spaces. And so what they really needed was a much more flexible, maneuverable aircraft that allow them to get in and out of emergency response situations. So what we have conceived in conjunction with NASA and the FAA and all of these emergency response organizations is we are asking teams around the world to build aircraft that perform 3 different missions. We have a productivity mission, which is back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, right? You think after a disaster when you have to keep supplying, keep furnishing supplies, right? Then there's maneuverability, in and out, up and down. Maybe it's a firefighter caught behind wildfire lines in a wind shift. Maybe it's in and out of buildings in an urban environment. And then the 3rd mission is adversity. High winds, water, just bad weather, right? And so we award prizes for each of those 3 missions. We also have a $1 million grand prize, and we have prizes for the teams along the way. So all of us, industry, the regulators, government entities, have come together to put on this prize where we award specific missions. Because at the end of the day, if you are in San Francisco, there may be a specific aircraft that works best for you. But if you are an island nation with flooding, there may be another type of vehicle that works best for you. And so what we wanted to do was seed the world with a number of different types of aircraft. And so to that end, not only do we have the competition, but we have mentors helping all of our teams. We have shepherds working with each of our teams for FAA certification and all of that. So it is throwing a huge number of resources at our teams to generate these emergency response aircraft.
You mentioned that you've spoken to numerous first responders as part of this. How do you both see the integration of these new solutions into existing solutions? Are they sort of looking at sort of augmenting what's already there, or is it sort of replacing sort of existing solutions? Sort of how do you see working with existing emergency services providers?
So one of our requirements is that these new aircraft are trailerable. So in our perfect world, in several years, there will be these types of emergency response aircraft at every police station, at every fire station, right? So that the ambulance or the fire truck or whatever it is can go as far as they can go on land, right? They trailer the aircraft behind them, and then it can take off vertically and rescue or help however one needs. So we see it, and what the months and frankly years of research told us is that first responders really want this extra tool, right? Helicopters, if you can afford them, they work well right now. You know, what Katarina and JUMP is doing is brilliant, and that will serve an incredibly important purpose. But there are other scenarios out there that first responders said, this is what we want, and frankly, there are a multitude of them, which is why we focus on the missions rather than a specific type of aircraft.
Do you think there's been an element of first responders just making do with helicopters? Because from what you're saying, there's all these different sort of markets and things they want to be able to do and can't, and you've reached the end of the ability that you can to innovate and serve with a helicopter or traditional stuff. So it's just the natural next step in terms of emergency services rather than sort of this radical revolution. It's just sort of a logical step.
I think there are a couple of different things going on. I think that in emergency, we just make do with whatever we have. I think that we've heard time and again from first responders that they do not have the tools that they need, and even most responders do not have helicopters, right? And helicopters don't work all the time, but they don't even have the helicopters, right? Also, there is a sea change, as we've all heard over the past 2 days, right? There is a sea change in aviation. This just really is this golden moment of aviation where you have transformative technologies that allow us to build, whether it's a blended wing aircraft or a Joby Flyer, new types of aircraft that did not exist even 5-7 years ago, right? Or we couldn't even build them 5-7 years ago. So those types of technologies are all being deployed by our teams around the world who are building these aircraft, and by JUMP as well. And so that is what is happening there. I think it is also imperative that everyone sees that there is a very high wall to climb if you are trying to transport people from an airport to a city center. I liken, and it is not as high a wall in emergency response. And I liken this, and Katerina and I have spoken about this before, I liken this to an ambulance siren. Everybody hates loud noises, but when it's an ambulance, you excuse it. Frankly, one of the reasons why we have been able to get NASA and the FAA on board as partners helping us with our technical rules and all of that is because all of these technologies that you've seen that will be deployed are much more acceptable in terms of community acceptance and adoption when it is saving your grandmother or you. And so we are a very good test case for the autonomy, for the AI, for the vertical flight, for the sense and avoid technology, for taking a pilot out of the loop, right? If it's an emergency, we as the public are much more forgiving.
Katerina, what are your use cases as well?
I'll kind of answer your question as well, just from our perspective. What we've seen in the 5 years that I've been at JUMP is that there's two things happening. Number one, there's an increase in ambulance deserts. An ambulance desert is defined as anybody who's living in an area in which an ambulance takes more than 23 minutes to get to you. And there's a push within first responder community to deliver care on site. So before it used to be transportation, if you look at like the history of EMS, it really started with hearses, right? So people would literally drive and then pick you up and then either drive you to the morgue or the hospital if you still had a chance. And this is like the history of EMS. And so people think of transportation, but really there's a huge evolution to ambulances becoming rolling clinics. And so ambulances are becoming more expensive. You need highly trained professionals. There's a lack of paramedics in this country. And so there's a real need for more nimble solutions. And there's a real lack, like you're saying, of funding for the traditional growing bulky solutions that they currently have, which are helicopters and ambulances. And so to your point, there's a real need for alternative solutions within the first responder community that would allow for, I don't know, lighter, more resource smart delivery of services.
So your aircraft is piloted by the EMT, the person providing the care. That's the dual purpose there. So there's an issue with pilots flying in aviation. So how are you sort of looking at, instead of just having a pilot being a pilot and then someone else being trained that's going with them as a thing, how do you see that solution?
So we went down this rabbit hole, because you have to be regulated by the FAA and you have to be regulated by the EMS community. So EMS community first responders break into two different categories, BLS and ALS. So BLS is basic life support, ALS is advanced life support. BLS is regulated by state, ALS is regulated by county. And so what we're doing is we're taking pilots and training them in BLS, so state by state. And that means you're trained on an EMT level, and that can be done, like I got my EMT when I first, took on this job, just to know more about how to be a first responder and what it's like. It took me about a semester in community college. It's not unsurmountable. And so we're really looking for pilots who are interested in a career, not as a CFI or not going into airlines. Here's another opportunity for you where you're going to get paid a lot higher to essentially pilot a light sport aircraft that's going to be much easier to pilot than you putting yourself in danger with a student.
What region, so if we're talking sort of globally, where do you see this first rolling out sort of geographically? Because are you talking sort of, is rural areas where the ambulance deserts are, is there overlap between, where there could be forest fires and where there's an ambulance?
Yeah.
Does that overlap necessarily?
Absolutely. And I think to Gwen's point earlier, we're creating an aircraft that's getting specialized help to the scene of whatever emergency that's necessary. It's really just the fastest form of human transportation, right? That's what we're really talking about here, in very small ranges. And so it's, getting somebody who's specialized in whatever. Like, we're talking about an increase in mass casualty events, right? So live shooter events, right? Like huge instances where an ambulance just can't get to a place because there's a crowd. So there's a lot of different applications, obviously. For us, because we're a startup and we have to think about, business strategy, we're launching with a focus on EMS in rural communities. And so for us, that's, the 4.5 million people who currently don't get the services that they need. But I think you should also answer this question because you've probably done a lot of research as well into like regions and where you're focused.
So part of being a global competition is that different regions have different concerns, right? And for us, I'm actually going to address an earlier question a little bit and then lead into this. When you spoke about autonomy and a pilot, at Go.Aero, one of our goals is to be able to take the pilot out of the loop so a first responder can focus on being just a first responder. So at Go.Aero, we have an autonomy prize, right, where we are actually pushing these aircraft to be as autonomous as possible. And so because we are a prize, we get to have a full spectrum from remotely controlled to some kind of pilot, where it's a pilot who isn't also an EMT, to taking the pilot completely out and having a fully autonomous aircraft that is delivering a first responder or delivering a patient who needs help without that pilot. We can do that because, once again, we have the luxury of having a competition where we have teams around the world, whether they are university-based teams or startups or established companies, with different degrees of expertise in a variety of areas. So some of our teams are phenomenal at autonomy and cutting-edge autonomous companies throughout the globe. Others are much better at constructing airframes and sense and avoid technology and all of that. And so what we hope is to catalyze the creation of a variety of different types of emergency response aircraft, so which gets into your current question, so that those who live in ambulance deserts, and as Katerina said, there are close to 5 million people just in the US alone who live in an ambulance desert. That means on a good day when the sun is shining, it takes 20 minutes or more for an ambulance to reach them. So that's in the US, and you can imagine in the world, I can throw out statistics, but I won't. Millions of others around the globe who live in ambulance deserts as well. And so for us, having the a veritable plethora of different types of designs is what is necessary because each region, each municipality, each country has different needs.
Do you see this use case as being one of the ways of building gradually public perception for autonomy? Because one of the big autonomy issues is that you don't want to get in an aircraft where you don't see a pilot, where you're so used to seeing two pilots in the cockpit. Do you think this is a way of this successfully working, is breaking down that barrier?
Absolutely, but it's not just what we believe, it's also what all the regulators believe. I mean, I can tell you that one of the reasons why, if you look, I don't have a slide here, but if you would throw up the slide of our partners, you would say, Boeing and RTX and Honeywell and NASA and the FAA and these 30 different organizations, they don't work together like that. But they do in this instance because they realize that there's a convergence of breakthrough technologies and because we are focused on this public good mission.
Yeah, and to second that, we have 2 STTR contracts with the U.S. Air Force, and we've been getting a lot of conversations from the U.S. Air Force on autonomy and about the ability, the use for this specific vehicle in this specific use case to be applied in DoD applications with the use of autonomy. So there's a huge overlap. There's a lot of interest from a bunch of different groups.
What about range? So how do you, do these aircraft need to be long range, or is it a case of they can be stationed in areas where there is a likelihood to be these issues, therefore the issue of range of batteries, say, is not so much of an issue because you can sort of mitigate that in where you can locate them?
Well, so if you don't mind, I'll take this one first. A typical ambulance has a range of like 100 miles, right, that it can cover, like within the, time-critical window in which, like the golden hour, if you have a heart attack, in which you have potential for survivability. Our aircraft can cover 30 nautical miles. And so if you think about within the 30 nautical miles, we can reach anywhere within 8 minutes. And that's 250 knots. And so that you can't go faster than that legally. And so it doesn't matter like what the range of the aircraft is. We're more constrained by time. And so within that 30 nautical miles, that's 2,800 square miles. We can cover, a lot more than the single ambulance can cover. And so if you're looking at time-sensitive, dash speed, focused applications, the range isn't as important.
And for us, because we have missions beyond delivering the first responder to someone in need, we have a prize solely for productivity, right? And productivity measures the range. How many times are you doing the back and forth? How long can you keep going? Because for some areas, range is extremely important. And for others, it really isn't. So we want the teams around the world to decide, based upon their location, which areas are most important for them to focus on.
Anyone from the audience got any questions for our panelists? No, we've got a couple of minutes left. So what about cost? Because I'm speaking from a UK perspective, a lot of the emergency solutions, they're charities. So a lot of the helicopter operators spend a lot of time raising money in order to fund their operations. So you've mentioned this is going to be, potentially could be a lot cheaper and obviously quicker. Like, is this a drastic degree more cost effective as a solution when it comes about for the people that are operating these sorts of missions?
I mean, I can speak to our aircraft. I think Gwen will be, very informative in speaking generally about the possibility of the technology to reduce costs. But, when we did our market research, our operating costs are half that of a helicopter, and only so much, like maybe a fraction of 2 or 3 times higher per year than an ambulance. And again, if you go back to seeing how much you can cover in the area, the number of people that fit within that area versus a single ambulance, and then you disperse that. So, obviously different business cases, there's a possibility for this to be part of the tax basis. And if you think about that as being part of the tax basis, even if you're in an area in which the population is like 1 person per square mile, you kind of amortize those operational costs across everybody. It's like cents a day. So it's a no-brainer compared to like buying a whole helicopter and operating it and all of the costs that go into that.
So I would echo Katarina's statements and say, as for us, as we are looking at it, what our first responders told us again and again is that they need these tools. What we are asking teams to do, because they are so much smaller than a typical helicopter, because they are trailerable, their costs are so much less. I cannot speak to specific costs for each of the designs because we're still getting the designs in from the teams around the world. And if I could just say to everybody here, running this competition really takes, we're creating a whole ecosystem. And so if any of you in the audience are interested in joining us as either a team competing or as a potential sponsor of a prize. For example, we have the autonomy prize, we have the productivity prize. We also have, right now over $3 million in prizes. We're happy to bring on more. We've got great press and publicity for all of our sponsors. So if you're interested in that, that would be wonderful. If you are interested in coming aboard as a mentor to one of our teams, as an expert, there's so many different ways to collaborate with us as we are all working together to try to bring this transformative technology into the world to actually save lives.
We've got one question that's just popped up on Slido asking about weather and environmental resiliency and whether there's any concerns about being unable to fly due to weather issues and how you sort of look at that as a challenge.
Yeah, so one of our missions is adversity, and we have a prize just for that adversity mission, and that is high winds and bad weather and uneven slope in terms of landing. And so we triangulate around a number of different poor weather functions in order to be able to award that prize. But let me be clear, no one is flying during a hurricane. No one is flying, through a tsunami. That's just not going to happen for any air vehicle at this point in time. But we want to be able to get in as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and we're not replacing anything, right? We're just adding. And so everything that we can possibly do is only going to improve the situation, which we're currently finding ourselves in. And so for our company, we're running a business. We're going to start with VFR. We're hopefully going to be able to certify IFR. But really, just VFR operations alone, I think, are going to offset a very large chunk of time-critical emergencies that are not currently being met.
Perfect. Katerina, Gwen, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for coming.